There's a particular kind of loneliness that follows people who grew up feeling unnoticed. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand anything. It just quietly settles into the corners of their personality, so quietly that even they may not realize where it came from. When a child consistently feels ignored, they don't simply feel sad in the moment. Their entire nervous system begins to build a worldview around that repeated experience. And when they grow up, that worldview becomes the blueprint for how they navigate every relationship, every opportunity, every moment where they might be seen. These adults enter rooms as if they're apologizing for breathing the air. They celebrate achievements in whispers, almost embarrassed, because some part of them has learned that their joy is an inconvenience. When someone offers a compliment, they don't just accept it, they brace themselves, waiting for the inevitable moment when the person realizes their mistake, when the praise gets retracted. In relationships, they ask, "Am I wanting too much?" Not because they are, but because somewhere in the tender, formative years of childhood, they absorbed the devastating lesson that their emotional needs were optional, that their feelings were burdens, that their very existence required justification. This isn't random. Psychologists call it an internalized neglect script, a learned expectation written in the language of silence that one's inner world will be dismissed. The child who reaches out again and receives nothing back eventually stops reaching, not because they stop needing, but because hope itself becomes too painful to sustain. Picture that child. Maybe they're at the dinner table, trying to share something that happened at school. Maybe they're holding up a drawing with both hands, arms stretched wide with anticipation. Maybe they're simply standing near their parent in the kitchen, waiting, just waiting, for eye contact, for acknowledgement, for some small sign that they exist in that person's awareness. And nothing comes. The parent is scrolling through their phone, staring ahead at some invisible worry, lost in a conversation that cannot be interrupted, too tired, too stressed, too overwhelmed by their own struggles to register that someone small and vulnerable is reaching out for connection. The child waits. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds that feel like eternity. Eventually, they lower their arms. They swallow their words. And something inside, something bright and open and trusting, closes just a little bit. Neglect isn't always dramatic. It's rarely the stuff of headlines or intervention. It doesn't leave bruises anyone can photograph. Often, it's simply silence. The absence of eye contact. The lack of curiosity. The thousands of small moments where a child hopes to be noticed and isn't. It's the parent who comes home from work and disappears into their own world without asking about anyone's day. It's the mother so consumed by anxiety that she can't slow down long enough to really look at her child. It's the father who is physically present but emotionally unreachable. They're in body but absent in spirit, like a mirage that disappears when you try to touch it. And because children can't yet understand the complexities of adult stress, depression, or intergenerational trauma, they fill in the gaps with the only explanation that makes sense to their developing minds. If I were more interesting, they would listen. If I mattered more, they wouldn't forget I was here. There must be something wrong with me. The child, in their innocence, takes responsibility for an adult's inability to connect. And that assumption becomes the foundation of everything they believe about themselves. Research in attachment theory tells us that children need responsive caregiving to develop secure relationships with themselves and others. When a baby cries and someone comes, when distress is met with comfort, the child's nervous system learns a fundamental truth. Asterisk, my needs are valid. I matter. I am not alone. Asterisk. But when emotional bids fall into silence, when reaching out yields nothing, a different lesson takes root. Asterisk, I am on my own. My feelings are not important. I should need nothing from anyone. Asterisk. Modern neuroscience shows us that chronic emotional neglect actually reshapes the developing brain. The stress response system stays activated. Cortisol levels remain elevated. The child's nervous system adapts to an environment where connection cannot be relied upon. It learns to expect disappointment. It braces for abandonment. And here's the heartbreaking irony. These children are often labeled easy, quiet, well-behaved, mature for their age. They don't cry much. They don't cause problems. They've learned to self-soothe, not as a healthy milestone, but as a survival strategy developed in the absence of reliable care. Parents sometimes brag, she's so independent. But beneath that apparent self-sufficiency lies a child who has simply stopped asking because asking has proven, time and time again, to be futile. The child who learned to disappear doesn't suddenly reappear at 18. That adaptation, that learned invisibility, becomes the lens through which they experience everything. Watch them at work. They're exceptional employees, reliable, never complaining. But when promotions come, they're overlooked. Not because they're unqualified, but because they've spent their entire lives practicing not being noticed. They don't advocate for themselves. Deep down, they don't believe they deserve recognition. Some become overachievers, pursuing success with desperate intensity, collecting accomplishments like evidence that they matter. But no amount of achievement fills the void, because what they're really seeking isn't success. It's the feeling of being seen by another human being. Others stop trying altogether. When hope dies enough times, the heart learns to stop hoping. They drift through life with resigned detachment, never fully investing in anything because investment requires hope, and hope requires believing something good might come from trying. In friendships, they're always available for others, but never ask for support themselves. They've mastered being the shoulder everyone cries on while ensuring their own tears remain invisible. When they're struggling, they suffer in silence, convinced that sharing their pain would be an imposition. In romantic relationships, the patterns become even more painful. Some avoid intimacy entirely, building emotional fortresses to prevent another disappointment. Others cling desperately, with an intensity that frightens partners away, thus confirming their deepest fear, that they are unlovable. Many become emotional chameleons, shape-shifting to fit what others want. They lose themselves in relationships because they never fully found themselves in childhood. Without someone to mirror their worth, they never developed a solid sense of self. So they become whoever you need them to be, hoping that being useful enough will make you stay. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of childhood emotional neglect is its invisibility. Adults who grew up this way often look back and say, "Nothing bad happened. I had food, shelter, clothes. My parents didn't hit me." But trauma isn't only the presence of harm, it's also the absence of what was needed. A child can have every physical need met while starving emotionally. The hunger is just as real, the damage just as profound. How do you explain that you're struggling because of what didn't happen? How do you mourn attention you never received, connection that was never offered, the emotional holding that never occurred? So these adults invalidate their own pain. Other people had it worse. I shouldn't complain. They minimize their suffering because their suffering was minimized from the beginning. But the nervous system doesn't lie. The hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting, the constant scanning for rejection, these aren't character flaws. They're adaptations to an environment that taught them they didn't matter enough to be noticed. And yet, and this is both heartbreaking and beautiful, many who grew up invisible develop extraordinary empathy. They become exquisitely attuned to others' emotional states. They notice when someone is struggling before words are spoken. They create space for others' vulnerability because they know what it feels like to have no space for their own. This sensitivity was earned through suffering. They learned to read their caregivers' moods to predict when it was safe to exist. It's a gift born from necessity, the foundation of deep compassion, but it often comes at tremendous cost. They notice everything about others while forgetting they deserve to be noticed too. Most parents who emotionally neglect their children aren't monsters. They're overwhelmed, exhausted, carrying their own unhealed wounds, battling depression, anxiety, financial terror. Many never learned how to connect because no one connected with them. Some are so focused on providing material security that they have nothing left for emotional presence. Others are drowning in their own pain and simply cannot see beyond their survival. Understanding this doesn't erase the impact. The child still experiences neglect regardless of the reason, but it can help adults look back with compassion rather than rage, recognizing that they weren't ignored because they were ignorable. The problem was never them. Healing begins not with transformation, but with acknowledgement. It starts when you say, even just to yourself, "What I experienced was real. The pain mattered. I deserved better." For people who learn to minimize their needs, this acknowledgement is revolutionary. Healing means learning to treat your feelings as valid. It means noticing when you apologize for having needs and asking, "What if my needs don't require justification?" It means celebrating wins without deflecting. Practicing vulnerability in safe doses. Setting boundaries. The hardest skill of all for someone who learned their boundaries didn't matter. Boundaries aren't cruelty. They're dignity. They're the declaration that you deserve to take up space. Neuroscience offers hope. The brain can rewire. Every time you assert a boundary and the relationship survives, you're updating your model of how relationships work. Every time you share a feeling and someone responds with care, you're building new neural pathways that whisper, maybe connection is possible. Maybe I'm safe to be seen. Healing is rarely loud. Sometimes it's as small as saying, I feel hurt, instead of swallowing it. Sometimes it's reminding yourself that you don't have to earn rest or affection. Sometimes it's simply sitting with the truth, my needs matter. When adults heal from childhood neglect, they often break patterns present in their families for generations. They become gentler parents, more attentive partners, more present friends, not because they had perfect models, but because they know, intimately, what it feels like to go unnoticed. The most beautiful part of this journey is realizing that the child who felt invisible didn't disappear. They survived. Their sensitivity, depth, intuition, empathy, these weren't weaknesses. They were adaptations, proof of resilience. So if you were that child, if you've learned to shrink yourself, if you convinced yourself your feelings were burdens, you deserve to hear this. You were not meant to live in silence. Your needs were never excessive. Your presence was never insignificant. You deserved attention, connection, warmth, not sometimes, but consistently. You matter now. You mattered then. And healing isn't about rewriting the past. It's about giving yourself, at last, the acknowledgement you always deserved. The child you once were may have been unseen, but the adult you are becoming is learning, slowly and bravely, to step into the light. You are here. You are real. You are worthy of being noticed. And that has always been true, even when no one was looking.